It's 5:39 in Atlanta. I am Eric Erickson. This is WSB in Atlanta's Evening News. Let's stick with Jeff Sessions here for a minute. Not the president being angry with him, but civil asset forfeiture, which, you know, I mean, of the most boring topics to talk about on radio, I don't know that we could find a topic more boring than civil asset forfeiture, but we still need to talk about it anyway. Because of what Jeff Sessions has done. Shame on him for doing what he's done. Civil asset forfeiture is something that the federal government and a lot of state governments have done over the years, where they have taken goods, property from people that they've accused of crimes. It's particularly in drugs. Essentially what they do is they say that these products, or this piece of property, this house, this land, this car, this clothing, this television, you name it, or this money, is ill-gotten gains from drugs, and as a result, you must forfeit it. Here's the catch. The person never has to be found guilty. In fact, in many cases, the person's not found guilty. They're found innocent. And because they're never charged with a crime in some cases, or they're found innocent, you would think they could get their property back, but they can't, because the state has already processed their property. They've taken away, and they're not entitled to compensation under the law. Think about that for a minute, how unconstitutional that is. And the Supreme Court has gotten it wrong in the past. Justice Thomas has been calling for the Supreme Court to reconsider these things. Jeff Sessions has decided he wants to expand civil asset forfeiture, and he wants to do it through adopted civil asset forfeiture. Let me explain this to you. In a number of states now, Scott Turner, by the way, here in Georgia in the legislature, has been one of the leading advocates for change on civil asset forfeiture in Georgia. He and others have pushed laws, and many states have adopted them, where local and state law enforcement are no longer allowed to do civil asset forfeiture. You're no longer allowed to take someone's property unless they have been found guilty by a jury. Good. That makes sense. That's constitutional. Well, what Jeff Sessions has announced he's doing is he's going to allow state and local law enforcement to do what's called adoptive civil asset forfeiture, where they adopt a federal civil asset forfeiture claim as their own. They take a federal claim. Federal civil asset forfeiture laws are a lot more liberal than state ones anyway. So they allow a local police office. Let's just use the Atlanta Police Department as an example. The federal government would allow the Atlanta Police Department to take a civil asset forfeiture claim that the federal government has against someone and go seize that person's property and keep it all except for 10%, and hand 10% over to the federal government. Let's say Georgia has a law that says the Atlanta Police Department's not allowed to engage in civil asset forfeiture. Well, under adoptive claims, they become an agent of the federal government. The local police become an agent of the federal government. And so they're not using Georgia law, they're using federal law. And Jeff Sessions says that's allowed, that's permissible. It shouldn't be. It breaks down federalism. It allows a local police department to essentially become part of the federal government by enacting and enforcing federal laws and taking property on behalf of the federal government. It should be wholly unconstitutional what Sessions is doing. Democrats and Republicans alike are outraged by this. This is not a conservative or liberal thing. This is a constitutional thing. Liberals and conservatives alike are outraged by it. And don't tell me it hasn't been abused. I've got some amazing cases to share with you that have been abused to show you we need not do what Jeff Sessions wants to do. But before we get there, let's go check traffic with Mark McKay. Thank you, sir. Now, this is from the Washington Post. In 2016, Oklahoma police seized $53,000 owned by a Christian band, an orphanage, and a church after stopping a man on a highway for a broken taillight. A few years earlier, a Michigan drug task force raided the home of a self-described soccer mom, suspecting she was not in compliance with the state's medical marijuana laws. They proceeded to take every belonging from the family, including tools, a bicycle, and even her daughter's birthday money. None of these people were charged with crimes. None of these people were found guilty of crimes. But the state decided that drugs were involved. And when the state decided drugs were involved, they decided that all of the assets had been purchased with drug money, whether that was true or not. And so they took it, and they never had to give it back. Don't tell me that is constitutional. I don't care what the Supreme Court says. The Supreme Court at one time said separate but equal was constitutional. At one point, the Supreme Court said Dred Scott was constitutional. The Supreme Court is not infallible. In the sense that it is, it's only because it's the court of last resort. The Supreme Court can screw things up, and this the Supreme Court has screwed up in the past. And Justice Thomas and others have been saying they need to reconsider it, and they should. Jeff Sessions should never have gone down this road. I realize he wants to be the law and order guy. I realize Jeff Sessions wants to be the tough enforcer. He doesn't need to go down a road that is clearly unconstitutional. He doesn't need to take people's property without people being found guilty by a court of law, without any right to get it back either. And he doesn't need to co-opt local law enforcement to do his dirty work for him. And that's what's happening here. If the president wants to be mad at Jeff Sessions, he should be mad at Jeff Sessions for this. He should not be mad at Jeff Sessions for standing by the president and loyally defending him even though he had to recuse himself. He should be mad at him for doing something as stupid as expanding civil asset forfeiture. It has no business being anything that any law enforcement agency in this country does.
When everything's changing around you, there's a voice that's consistent and honest. Erick Erickson. Every day, 5 till 7. News 95.5 and AM 750. WSB.
I just like to wait for the horns. There we go. I like this song. Welcome back. It's Erick Erickson here, 55 after the hour. The phone number 404-872-0750, 1-800-WSB Talk. Let's go back to the phones. Michael, how are you?
How are you, sir?
Good. How are you? What's going on?
Good. Quick question. Would the asset forfeiture argument be a Fourth Amendment argument? And second quick part to that, why do you think we're seeing such a degradation of the Fourth Amendment in the last 10 to 20 years?
Well, I think that we're probably seeing a degradation of the Fourth Amendment in the last 20 years, largely because we've become very law and order, and people have, I think, in the last 20 years or so, even before 9/11, been willing to trade freedom for safety and security. I mean, the Fourth Amendment is the right of the people to be secured in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. No warrant shall be issued. Probable cause. Now, it is the 14th Amendment, I think, is really the big one here with civil asset forfeiture, that no one should be deprived of their life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the people are being deprived of their property without due process of law. But it all goes to the same thing. And that is that people have for a long time been thinking it's not me, it's them. I'm not committing a crime, so I have nothing to worry about. If those people got something taken by the government, well, by God, they must have done something wrong, whether or not they actually did. And then, oh, by the way, Mr. Government, Uncle Sam, please keep me safe, keep me safe. That's a real problem. We have a situation in the country that really needs to be tackled quickly if the courts aren't going to do it by the several legislatures of the various states and by Congress. Congress is afraid to act because they think that if they act, they're going to be perceived as being weak on crime. No, I think they're going to be strong on property rights. Conservatives should be leading on this issue. It is a property rights issue. And we should be standing up to people like Jeff Sessions, even though he's technically on our side, when they do stuff like this. Now, when we come back, the discrepancy between what the public is interested in and what media coverage they're getting.
All right, have we got Heather?
We
Excellent. Heather MacDonald is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal, where she has covered a range of topics, including higher education, immigration, homelessness, policing, and criminal justice reform and race relations. As I have said a million times, I think Heather is one of the very few of the best reporters in this country. If she were a leftist, she would have a stack of Pulitzer Prizes on her desk. Her newest book is the New York Times bestseller, The War on Cops, which I read, and I thought it was a deeply important book, really worth reading. That was in 2016, and it's basically about the fact that Black Lives Matter has got it all wrong. How you doing, Heather?
Thanks for having me on, Drew, and thank you for those kind words. I greatly appreciate it.
No, it's all true, and I've said it for years. I'm glad the bestseller list finally reflects it.
Yeah, well, the Times is not too happy, I'm sure.
Well, I noticed. I mean, it is incredible to me. You are one of the few reporters who goes out into the street to get this story, who really goes and gets, and you're never on mainstream TV. They never turn to you, even as a dissenting voice, to say, here's Black Lives Matter on one side, here's Heather on the other. They never do it.
Well, after the 5 Dallas officers were assassinated in July last year, CNN toyed with having me on Saturday, the day after, and then canceled.
Of course.
I mean, you cannot have a more concrete demonstration of the fact that they are simply unwilling to listen to the other side.
Well, speaking of that, recently you were out here in California and you went to Pomona and UCLA. And I think this story got a little swept away in all the kind of drama at Berkeley, which was also definitely interesting. But could you describe, especially the Pomona experience, because shocking is an overused word, but it's shocking. Can you describe what happened when you went? First of all, you went to speak about the Black Lives Matter War on Cops issue. Was that what you were there for?
Yes, I was there to talk about my book and to make my argument that there's no government agency more dedicated to the proposition that Black Lives Matter than the police. And the day before I got to Claremont McKenna, I got an email from one of the administrators saying they'd gotten wind of protest and were looking to move my talk to a building with fewer plate glass windows and better means of egress. So that was a little bit worrisome. When I did arrive, they said, well, we haven't heard any more about these protests, so we're keeping it in the original building known as the Athenaeum. I was put into a safe house for about 2 hours, with the blinds drawn, during which I heard the chanting growing louder and louder and the drumming. I saw a petite blonde woman walk by with her face covered in a Palestinian headscarf, of course, and a big battery pack on her back like a jetpack to amplify her bullhorn. There was what appeared to be a lookout posted on maybe a football field away on my looking over into my balcony. I didn't see what was happening, however. That was outside my range of vision. What I learned later was that the building, the Athenaeum, was being blockaded by about 250 to 300 students who prevented anybody from entering, whether it's their fellow students or professors. They made very short shrift of the police efforts at protecting the entrances. They completely ignored the barricades the officers had put up. The cops stood by, let them take over the building. So all of the events that had been planned for me to talk to students beforehand, the dinner, all went out the window. I addressed a large empty auditorium. They moved the podium away from the visual range of the windows because they were worried that when night fell and the podium became lit up, that it would be visible to the outside people who were banging on the windows. So I gave my talk to an empty room. The people that were in it were basically police officers. It was disconcerting because they were glued to what was happening outside. The windows, which I could hear, which again was people banging on the windows and chanting. I took 2 questions from a live streamed audience, and then the cops decided that they could no longer guarantee my safety, and so the Q&A was peremptorily shut down, and a escape plan was planned out the kitchen. So I was quickly hustled out through a group of students perched on some stairs and put into a police van, and we sped away to the Claremont Police Department.
Unbelievable. And now, has any action been taken about this? Has the administration of the college done anything, any disciplinary action at all?
Nothing that I'm aware of yet. The president said he was planning to do so. I suppose there's a certain amount of due process for once, these being protesters and not alleged heterosexual male rapists. So I don't know, what the a reasonable expectation is to see whether President Chodosh is true to his word or not. I frankly, in this case, will not be surprised if he does levy some sort of punishment, because this event has been a real black eye for Claremont McKenna. I
mean, you wrote a piece that I thought was sensational in City Journal about a letter that some of the black protesters who called themselves We Few. I was happy to hear like Henry V quote. They called themselves We Few. But this, what you said about this letter, I thought got to the heart of it. First, can you describe what their argument was?
Oh, please, Andrew, no. It's not. There is no argument. It's just a garbled high theory, and if I can't read it literally, it cannot be summarized. I mean, you have to read this stuff. It is a parody of academic discourse that today substitutes for thinking. To the extent they had an argument, it was potted, rehashed. Michel Foucault claiming that the Enlightenment is responsible for the concept of truth, and somehow truth is oppressive, and even more so, free speech is oppressive. They claim that the Enlightenment is responsible for racism, patriarchy, colonialism, feminism. What has to be understood, and the other thing that I say about theirs, is that their writing is simply abysmal. They cannot construct sentences. They have no sense of what grammar or syntax or usage is. And these are students, some of the co-signatories are graduating this year. This shows what is going on in college campuses, especially for minority students, because nobody dares correct their writing. They've been brought in under double standards, to their misfortune, because nobody is helped by preferences that bring you into an academic environment that you're not prepared to operate in. But the other thing is that their history is so ignorant. It is facile. It consists only of labels without knowledge behind it, and for them to charge that free speech is oppression, leaving aside their ignorance of the Enlightenment, and we know for sure that they've never read Voltaire or Diderot or Kant or Hume, for them to say that free speech is oppression ignores the fact that free speech was essential to getting rid of slavery, as Frederick Douglass himself wrote in 1860 in a plea for free speech, saying, slavery cannot survive free speech. It was essential to the civil rights movement. So the one thing that you would think with black studies in college and the American high school curriculum being taken over exclusively by the black story, that they would understand is the importance of the First Amendment to liberating minorities in this country, and yet they're ignorant even of that.
And your point about the grammar of this letter, which I thought was really well made in your article, it's not a small point. It is not a small point that these kids have gone through college ignorant of history, ignorant of the English language, incapable of writing a letter with an argument in it. I mean, that's a major, major failure of the professors, the academics at this institution. I mean, that is a terrible thing to have done to them. But let's move on to the actual meat of what you're saying. What did you go to say that made you such a danger to these people that they would resort to violence? I mean, you seem like a perfectly nice person. What was the heart of what you were going to say to them?
I said that there is enormous support for the police. What I prefaced my remarks was I said, for the last 2 hours, I've been hearing chants that Black Lives Matter, and of course, I don't know if you get censored on this. Should I say F the police? I don't know if you bleep out the...
we bleep out those, yes, we do.
F the police, and of course, hey, hey, ho, ho, Heather Mack has got to go, and from Palestinian to this, from something to the sea, Palestinians must be free. But what I said was, I've been hearing about Black Lives Matter. I hope that you therefore were just as upset when Aaron Shannon Jr., a 5-year-old boy in South Central Los Angeles, was shot to death in his Spider-Man costume on Halloween in 2010 by a Kitchen Crips gang member. I hope that you were equally upset when Tyshawn Lee in 2015 November in Chicago was lured into an alley with the promise of candy by his father's gang enemies and assassinated in cold blood. The original plan had been to cut off Tyshawn's fingers and send them to his mother. The killers of Tyshawn escaped with the body in the trunk and dumped it in Indiana. Not a single Black Lives Matter protester showed up at that event, but I said the people who did care about it were the police. They worked their hearts out day and night to bring that killer to justice. The father himself refused to cooperate with the police in identifying his son's killers, typical of gang members and the no-snitch ethic in the inner city. And I went on to say, if any of you had had any loved one lost to gun violence, the first thing you would do is call the police, and the second thing you would do is ask, why is that thug, why was he still on the streets? Because he would inevitably have had a long criminal record, and yet, contrary to the myth of mass incarceration, would be out on the streets free to kill again.
You know, it makes a weird kind of sense when they write a letter saying that objectivity is not a real thing, the truth is not a real thing, that only leaves the story that's being told. It makes perfect sense that they have to silence you because you're bringing facts that ruin their narrative, and that's that there is a weird, horrible logic to it. Let me ask you one more question before I let you go, and I don't want to put you on the spot politically because I know you're not that kind of journalist, but clearly the Obama administration was guilty of exacerbating this problem of casting the police in a terrible light. How do you feel things are going now? Is this an improvement? Is what's happening now an improvement for the police, or it's, staying the same, or how do you feel about it?
No, it's an enormous improvement. Trump got it right. He said there's a false narrative about the police. He pledged to restore law and order during the campaign. He was the only person who pointed to the rising black homicide toll, thanks to the Black Lives Matter narrative and the fact that cops are now backing off of proactive policing in inner cities. And amazingly, this shows you how perverse our racial rhetoric is. When Trump said that black parents have the same right to be able to walk their child to school without fear that that child will be shot as white parents do, he was denounced as a racist. President Obama dismissed the rising black homicide toll. We had the largest one-year increase in homicides in 2015 in nearly 50 years. Overwhelmingly, the victims were black. 900 more black males were killed in 2015 compared to the previous year. Obama said, not to worry, Trump's exaggerating. It's just a blip in a few cities. In other words, Black Lives Matter don't matter when they haven't been taken by a police officer. Jeff Sessions, his attorney general, is doing great things. He wants to review federal consent decrees for police departments, which are grotesquely unnecessary, wildly expensive, and take officers off the streets to write endless reports for this overpaid, ignorant federal monitor. So, no, I have big hopes that at least the narrative coming out of the White House will change, and that will, I hope, remoralize the cops.
Heather MacDonald, excellent reporter. The War on Cops, a terrific book. It's great to see you, and I hope you'll come back and we'll talk some more.
Thanks, Drew. I appreciate it so much.
Bye-bye. See you.
That's right, Brooke. Multiple officials tell myself and my colleague Barbara Starr that U.S. intelligence has assessed, though not formally concluded, that North Korea today possesses the capability to miniaturize a nuclear warhead, put it atop an intercontinental ballistic missile. Now, to be clear, this is not yet a consensus intelligence community view. That is one thing, and it is also the view of the U.S. intelligence community that this remains an untested capability. And of course, testing is key to be able to get that re-entry vehicle back into the atmosphere after launching a missile with this range. That said, this is part of consistent progress that North Korea has been making over the last several months and years in this direction. One person briefed on the intelligence telling me that it's a question of when, not if, North Korea will get this capability and test this capability. Keep in mind as well that the U.S. military has been preparing along these lines for some time, giving itself offensive military options to deal with a capability like this, as well as defensive options. But again, multiple officials telling us that this is an assessment in the U.S. intelligence community that North Korea has an untested capability of putting a miniaturized nuke on top of an intercontinental ballistic missile. And Brooke, that is not an insignificant step forward.
We're also now seeing some very ominous new saber rattling coming in from Kim Jong-un's North Korea, which is threatening to turn parts of South Korea into, quote, a sea of flames and ashes. Our Pentagon correspondent Barbara Starr has been working with sources. Barbara, what are you hearing about this latest nuclear threat from North Korea?
Wolf, tonight, I have to tell you, most of the sources I'm talking to, analysts in the intelligence community, military officials, U.S. administration officials, express growing concern about this North Korean rhetoric. U.S. officials are telling me that they now believe it is probable, in their analysis, in some analysis, that North Korea has a miniaturized nuclear warhead. Not a firm conclusion, but some in the intelligence community believe that he probably does have a miniaturized warhead. Why is this so significant? If Kim Jong-un can put a warhead, a nuclear warhead, on a ballistic missile, launch it, and have it hit a target thousands of miles away, this gives him the capability to pose a threat to the United States, to the Asian allies, to really upend security around the world. And this missile that he wants to put it on, at least one of the missiles, is a mobile missile, so finding that launcher will be very difficult in times of war, and it's also solid fuel. What does that mean? That means it's all fueled up, ready to go on a mobile launcher that can be running around North Korean country roads, launching a nuclear warhead. That is the scenario that has had the U.S. most worried, and tonight they believe that Kim may have achieved a significant step down that road, and that's a miniaturized warhead. Whether it works right now, who knows, but they do think that, in the words of one official, probably he has one.
Are officials also concerned North Korea will conduct another underground nuclear test?
Extremely concerned, Wolf. There's an underground nuclear site where the North Koreans have dug some 3 underground tunnels that they could put test material into. One of those tunnels, for a variety of engineering reasons, is very available right now to the North Koreans. U.S. officials telling me they are seeing signs that North Korea may be preparing for another underground test. He wants to try making a hydrogen bomb. All of this adds up to Kim Jong-un is very determined to go down the road of these weapons, these nuclear weapons.
This is Mises Weekends with your host, Jeff Deist.
Welcome back once again to Mises Weekends. We're featuring a video this week instead of a guest interview with Patrick Byrne, who's actually going to be the keynote speaker at our upcoming event in San Diego in 2 weeks. So if any of you are in the Southern California area, there's still time to register for that at Mises.org/events. Patrick, many of you probably know, is the founder and CEO of Overstock.com, but he's actually much more than that. He holds degrees from Dartmouth and Stanford and Cambridge, actually a PhD from Stanford. He's very deep on a broad variety of topics. He can talk about Eastern religion, Austrian economics, e-commerce and supply chain, but especially blockchain technology, which is where his heart is. And he's personally invested in some technology that's going to bring blockchain to a whole host of transactions that currently require titling and lawyers and that sort of thing. This is a fascinating talk, longer than our usual weekend show, but absolutely worth your while.
We think we're doing something quite disruptive, that we're building something quite disruptive. And I'll start with, there's a conservative writer, he's out at Hoover, Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a book about, called Trust, that says that the reason, and this was written in the mid-90s, and it was the reason Germany and Japan and the United States do so much better than companies like Italy and China, is that it's a question of trust. In a place like China, there aren't central institutions that are trustworthy. You only trust people in your own family. And so economic enterprises can't get bigger than, can't get bigger than really one big family can run. And Italy kind of runs the same way. And the theory, Fukuyama said, was that handcuffs the size of enterprises and hence the efficiency and the ability of the economy to grow. What's left out of his analysis, what's left out of his analysis is the problem of centralized institutions. And the problem of centralized institutions is they get captured. Regulatory capture is much more a feature of the political process. Regulatory capture came out in 1972, I think. A friend of Milton Friedman's, George Stigler, wrote about this. I think it's the first formal description of which I'm aware. But it's the tendency, we set up regulators to protect us from certain industries, not remembering that those regulators have a tendency to become captured by those industries and turned against us. The SEC being but one example that comes to mind. And there's even possibility of deep capture, which is that they capture not just the regulator, but the political process and the journalists and even academics. I have a website called, which Dr. Salerno mentioned, deepcapture.com, which investigates this in the US and has won all kinds of awards for investigation of corruption in the United States. The problem with captured centralized institutions is that they generate what John Kenneth Galbraith calls the bezel. And I'm reminded of somebody once said, all great economists are tall with the exception of Milton Friedman and John Kenneth Galbraith, which the economists will get here. Galbraith was a terrible economist, but he did have this, his idea of the bezel was that at any given point, if you could freeze time and ask everybody what they had in the financial system and add it up, you would get this. And you look at what's actually there, and there's only this much there. And the difference is the bezel. It is the amount that has been embezzled from society and has accumulated the bezel. Well, I became a believer about a decade ago that there's quite a bezel built into our financial system. The essence of the crypto revolution is that it can solve that problem. In fact, one way to think of it is for 6,000 years of recorded human history, we've always faced a choice. Do we want, when we have our consensual exchange, do we want to go peer-to-peer, or in which case trust becomes a factor? Can I trust you? I'm trading you this camel for this gold coin. How do I know have you debased the gold coin or not debased the gold coin? So we can go that way, or we can have a centralized institution. There's a business model, somebody who has the monopoly on force, and this oasis has gold coins minted, stamps his face on them, and then if anyone debases that, kills them. That's a business model of monetizing your monopoly on force in a situation. That's one business model. That's one way to do it. What the crypto revolution lets us do for the first time in human history is go back, get away from central institutions and go back to peer-to-peer exchange that is trustworthy. Fortunately or unfortunately, there are a lot of social and political institutions which have as their business model now what I just described, and this is going to disrupt them. So I think that this is, unlike Al Gore, I was not around quite for the beginning of the internet, but I was here a few years after the beginning of the internet, and we had an idea we were doing something as big as the Gutenberg Bible. I think the crypto revolution is going to be more significant than that, because of the accumulation of our centralized institutions, which in one way or another are in the business of, since you can't trust each other, you need us. And crypto, and so you can't have peer-to-peer, you have to have a central institution. Well, we're going to turn them into a buggy whip manufacturers. We don't need those centralized institutions anymore. I'm going to give you a few examples. Well, there's, of course, central banking. The central counterparty clearing system, which I'll be going into. Here's another. In development economics, there's long education summarized, I'll even skip this. I used to study development economics and decided it was much simpler than people made it out to be. It's not done from the top down, it's done from the bottom up, grassroots. Funds are fungible. In other words, there's a whole lot of money sloshing around in the world of development theory, and there's so much graft. And it's about women. If you want to help the world, it's about women. If you, I remember reading papers on an experiment done in India where you take a village and you take a very good way to measure increase in well-being in a family is you look at the weight of children in a family. You take one village, you give money to men, and you look for an increase in the weight of children. And the truth is you get nothing. You increase the male income, you get nothing. But as this economist put it, three things: an increase in consumption of alcohol, tobacco, and hookers. And I said that to Buffett once, and he said, yeah, and the rest of it they waste. But as a joke, Buffett is a very square teetotaler guy. But anyway, you take an identical village, you increase the income of women, and you immediately get this increase in the weight of children. Women bank calories in their children, and the same experiment's been done in Africa and South America and such. Development's all about women. But there's a missing foundation. There's an economist from Peru, Hernando de Soto, who for years argued, Mystery of Capital is his big book, that in the West there's a bell jar. Some people live within the bell jar of formal legal rights, and they include rights to private property. And with title to property, an entrepreneur can you can have an incentive to improve your property. You can pledge it to a bank and raise capital. You can use the capital to expand your business. However, much of the economic activity in the world goes on outside that bell jar, and there isn't an access to. And he documents in Haiti and Peru and stuff. In Haiti, you may have lived for 3 generations on a piece of land and built your home, and your grandfather, great-grandfather built the home, and you've added on, and you don't know. You don't. If someday the local generalissimo can show up and say, "Oh, senor, you don't understand. That's our property," and you never know. And if you try to get property, it might take you 35 years and 400 steps, 400 stamps from petty bureaucrats along the way. And every one of those petty bureaucrats wants a payoff. So in that kind of a world, there is no incentive to improve your land. Or less incentive to improve your land. And you certainly can't pledge it to a bank to raise capital. Expansion is thwarted. The capital is dead. He argues that if you had good land titling systems around the world, it would create far, hundreds of times more capital would be liberated in the developing world than has ever been transferred to the developing world through Western aid. That it's all there, that all we need to do is create land titling systems. Well, the implication for crypto, it is possible. So by crypto, I mean the blockchain. If you've heard of Bitcoin, which I assume everyone's heard of Bitcoin, Bitcoin is just one application of a new technology that was described 6 years ago. It's based on the mathematics of cryptography. And it's basically, call it the blockchain. The blockchain you can apply towards currency, and you get a cryptocurrency, that's Bitcoin. But you can apply it I recently was out in Silicon Valley at a company that's working through this, and they have a list of 180 things that the blockchain can be applied towards, and that they think they're just going to step through and come up with a crypto alternative to each. It's possible to develop a land titling system that would be robust, incapable of being cheated, and everything would occur within the blockchain. Why that's, and who's working on this now, no one that I can find, closest I can find is Kate and I know some people who are working on smart contracts, which would be sort of a step towards this. But the really big idea is combining financial capital with human capital, which is to say Wall Street. We can replace a lot of the functions of Wall Street, or a significant amount of what's done on Wall Street can be moved into the world of crypto. And I'm going to have to go through why this is important and why it's possible. First, you probably all know the efficient market hypothesis, even if I hope no one here agrees with it. But in the efficient market hypothesis, every security has an intrinsic value. And over time, its price is fluctuating around. And you can imagine under one regulatory regime, there's that much noise, that much fluctuation. Under a different regulatory regime, there's that much fluctuation. And if you add up all the area in yellow, and you add up all the area in green, the area in green is less than yellow, meaning there's less noise in the system. So regulatory regime B is considered to be more efficient. That's the dominant paradigm of our regulators these days. That's their paradigm. However, and in that paradigm, it is not possible to rig the market. You can't manipulate the market any more than people at a horse track who are up playing games in the betting parlor, and I suppose they had some technique in the betting. That, of course, doesn't affect the underlying horse race. That follows from efficient market hypothesis. Turns out it's not true, and I'd like to show you what this is supposed to be. This is that scene in The Matrix. Remember when Neo says you can, or Morpheus says you can have the red pill or the blue pill, and you take the blue pill, you wake up in bed, believe anything you want to believe, or with the red pill, I'll show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. There was a massive scheme. Market manipulation has become a regular feature of our markets. And to give you just one example, if you haven't been reading the papers and reading about the LIBOR scandal and the foreign exchange scandal and the benchmark rigging scandal and so on, and naked shorting, et cetera, one of my favorite examples is these are two lawyers, Bill ERICK and Melvin Weiss. They ran a law firm called Milberg Weiss that in 2000, they were the originators of the plaintiff strike class action suit. These suits you hear about where a share of stock goes down and a law firm files a suit and against the company on behalf of all these plaintiffs. Well, it turns out that they were using shill plaintiffs, and the DOJ indictment from 2006 refers to these, and you can't, in the U.S. law firms, you can't pay people to be shills. Well, the law firm, the DOJ indictment on page 29 says the paid plaintiffs purchased securities at issue anticipating the securities would decline in value in order to position themselves to be named plaintiffs in security class fraud class actions. Well, there's something very odd about that sentence. If you think about it for a minute. The paid plaintiffs, those are the shills, they purchased securities anticipating the securities would decline in value. How'd they know? Turns out these people were being directed to go out and buy stock in certain companies weeks or a month before suddenly they melted down and these lawsuits could be filed. How'd they know? If the market's efficient, that you could never have done that. And these guys, Bill ERICK and Marvin Weiss, they're not stock investors, but they were able to send people to specific companies ahead of time, weeks or a month ahead of time, and buy their stock. And then, what do you know, the stock melts down and they could file their lawsuits. It's because they were part of, these guys went to jail, the law firm, it was the 8th largest law firm in America, it melted down. Greenspan, in October 2008, when everything was melting down and he testified to Congress, and they said, what's going on here? He explained to them this thing that the left has jumped on this quote from Greenspan. The left jumped on it to say, oh, look, Greenspan shows that markets don't work.
There are additional regulatory changes that this breakdown of the central pillar of competitive markets requires in order to return to stability, particularly in the areas of fraud, settlement, and securitization.
The real problems were particularly in the areas of fraud, say Bernie Madoff, securitization, that's mortgage-backed securities, but settlement. Settlement is this really important issue, and there's someone here, Caitlin Long, who knows an awful lot about this, about settlement. It's dull as dishwater, but I hope you'll stick with me for 5 minutes, because first, who here owns any stock in any publicly traded company in America? Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Every single one of you with your hand up is incorrect. None of you own any stock. It's not how the system works. How the system works is, suppose you've got grandma buying some stock from a hedge fund, who I represent as Gordon Gekko. You think it works like this. Money and stock change hand. That's called settlement. But in fact, of course, we know that they don't speak to each other directly. Oh, well, the systems are divorced in the US, by which the system by which money changes hands and stock changes hands. They each are represented by brokers, and we think, well, the money and the stock goes between accounts between them. That's not even really how it works. All the broker dealers in America are plumbed into a central organization you've never heard of called the DTCC. And the DTCC is where the money and stock changes hands. But the truth is, it's not even that simple. What's going on is it's all within the DTCC, and it just changes hands in accounts within the DTCC. And in fact, it's even one step more removed from that, which is there's a company, a subsidiary of the DTCC, which owns all the stock in America. Nobody owns any stock but this company. It's called CD & Company. This was all set up in 1973 because there was a paperwork crisis on Wall Street. And it owns all the stock. And then it issues contractual rights, IOUs to that stock. And so when you have a broker telling you you own 100 shares of IBM, what you really have, if you read your broker statement, the fine print, you have a contractual right to a contractual right to a contractual right to a contractual right to a company that actually has the property rights. We laugh at the Soviet Union for having tried to run a society without property rights. How could you possibly do that? But in our society, our property rights have been turned into this system in the last 40 years. And our property rights have been sliced, diced, circumcised, digitized, hypothecated, rehypothecated, and the systems are losing track of who owns what. And this shows up, this is the common denominator of a number of the scandals you've heard about in the last 7 years. It comes back to the systems are losing track of who owns what. I'll skip the why that there is fault tolerance in the system, and some criminals have figured out how to abuse the fault tolerance to play certain games. Why it matters is you as Austrians will recognize this. This is one paradigm of how securities get priced. Here's another paradigm. As there's supply, demand, they meet, there's a price. If someone can show up and using this fault tolerance create apparent supply in the marketplace, they can shift a supply curve. And if they can do it enough, and especially against a financial company, there's ways of breaking the back of a financial stock. This is part of what happened in 2008. And everybody was saying from 2005 to 2008, I had, a lot of people saying I was crazy. New York Post used to run photos of me with UFOs coming out of my head because I was saying, look, there's this stuff going on, you don't understand. And then in 2008, when everything started melting down, the SEC went and did exactly what I'd been telling them they needed to do for 4 years. It's now become quite a problem. The Economist is writing about it. It's actually, I think that in the last 2 years, settlement failures have finally been addressed because it's a national security issue. Finally, some people in the national security establishment have gotten that it's a national security issue, and you can't count on the SEC, which in my view, the SEC is just towel boys for Wall Street. They're not up to the game. By the way, that's why these guys were part of the ring of criminals who are taking advantage of this. And because they're part of the ring, that's how they knew a month ahead of time or 2 months ahead of time what companies to set their show plaintiffs up in front of. So how can this all, I started taking all this data and economists and insiders and people who are really inside baseball kind of guys in to explain this on Wall Street. And I'm reminded of a line of Bertrand Russell. There's a story that Bertrand Russell was once in India teaching Einstein's relativity or something. And somebody, a Hindu, stood up in the back and said, "I'm sorry, Professor Russell, you have it all wrong. The universe rides on the back of a turtle." And Russell said, "Okay, well, what's the turtle ride on?" And the Hindu cosmology professor said, "The back of another turtle." And Russell said, "Okay, well, what's that turtle ride on?" And the guy said, "I'm sorry, Professor, it's turtles all the way down." I started bringing this kinds of information with hard data and respected economists explaining this to the NASD, FINRA, the SEC, the U.S. House Banking Services, Senate Financial Services, the New York Press Corps, et cetera, et cetera. And what I discovered is our establishment was turtles all the way down. Up until 2008, I was just laughed. After 2008, I got a lot of attention, and there were a lot of changes and all kinds of actions brought. And it's kind of funny because I'll look at some actions brought against people, and they'll include whole paragraphs out of papers I wrote 8 years ago explaining to some law enforcement people exactly how a certain thing is being done. And 5 years later, there's somebody arrested, and there's whole paragraphs out of stuff I wrote that are used in their indictments. So I'm happy about that. Here's a recent. You may have heard, who here has heard of the book Flash Boys? Flash Boys, this recent Michael Lewis book about the flash trading on Wall Street. This is how much actual trading, how much volume there is on Wall Street over the last 10-ish years. Now, here's how many quotes there are on Wall Street. The difference, this is all the flash trading. This doesn't represent any actual activity. This is all front running. People are front running your orders. This is nuclear powered front running. 90% of the volume now in the market is front running of orders by these computers that are talking back and forth to each other 10,000 times a second. So I don't think this is good. Warren Buffett referred to this recently. See, the regulators like liquidity, because under the efficient market hypothesis, the more liquidity there is, the more selling back and forth there is, the more those curves get squeezed down to the intrinsic value. So any liquidity is good. But Buffett recently said, this isn't liquidity, this is volume. It doesn't really add anything to the marketplace, but it's become 90% of the market. In fact, there was a recent Journal of Finance article that showed the US markets got saturated with liquidity, beyond which no liquidity has actually helped in pricing, sometime in the late 60s. So all this stuff, Paul Volcker said back during the crash that the last financial innovation that actually added value to society was the ATM machine. Nothing else you've heard about since then. All these fancy complex derivatives and everything, they don't really add any value to society. So the current system, and I'm drawing to the end, Wall Street has centralized settlement, high-frequency trading, and its current regulatory environment. The shortcomings of these are the centralized settlement is easy to manipulate, and the bad guys have figured out how to do it. High-frequency trading is just amassed to nuclear-powered front-running, and our regulatory environment has been deeply captured. So the simplest solution is to take Wall Street as we know it, and drag it behind the barn and kill it with an axe. It cannot be fixed, nor does it need to be fixed. Instead, we can move this to the blockchain. And in the blockchain, the virtues of blockchain would be it's peer-to-peer settlement, no centralized settlement, no manipulation. Egalitarian instead of front-running, and most importantly, there's nothing to capture. It's consensus-based. It's stateless. Now, we have to get the permission of the state to turn it on, but we're building this, and it's nearly built. And when it gets built, we'll be turning it on, and it's stateless, and there's nothing to capture. And this is what trading would look like. It would be a Bitcoin or blockchain trading would look like this. It's peer-to-peer based in the blockchain. There's no DTCC to capture. There's no None of the games, there's no flash trading, none of the games that are being played in Wall Street now could be played. So this is my next big ambition, and I hope you see as a consistent theme through this how much of my entrepreneurial activities and drives have actually been informed by the things I've learned over the years from studying Austrian economics. So thank you very much.
Subscribe to Mises Weekends via iTunes U, Stitcher, and SoundCloud, or listen on Mises.org and YouTube.